Okay, now we move to chapter 4, A Powerful Woman, Walker, Missouri, 1906, or as my grandfather used to call it, '06. The beginning of a day always brought a softness to Dot, a peacefulness, because while she cooked, she could hear her husband shaving and dressing in the other room, the sounds of a straight razor slicing through stiff overnight whiskers, the splashing of the water she'd heated earlier on the stovetop, the slapping of cologne, the snaps of suspenders. On her face was always a purposeful look as the flapjacks and the salt pork sizzled. A strand of reddish blonde hair would invariably fall over her brow, which she would blow aside. Now and then she'd scratch an itch on her forehead with the back of her wrist. At 7:20 every morning, you could set your watch to it, would come the chugging of an automobile. For 800 smackaroos, we could own one of those things, Bob would joke as they'd watch the dark green machine from the window with its shiny brass headlamps making its way through the crowd, the carriages and horses stopping to let it pass. Nearly 40,000 automobiles were registered in the country, but most were seen on major city streets. The sight of one in an outlying town like Walker, situated between Kansas City and Springfield, was rare. The Stanley steamer. Now there's a machine, Bob would say. One of those I wouldn't mind owning. Passing by her second-floor window, she could look down at the sign extending above the door one floor below. It announced Doctors Love and Wright. A week ago, it carried only Dr. Stanley Love's name. She laughed as she wondered how it ever happened that she ended up here, a place where she once swore she'd never go. She'd only go if the devil chased her there. With a switch, she would say. She'd been bamboozled somehow. I've met a girl back here, he had said, and unless you marry me now, I'm going to stay here and marry her. Bamboozled by the woman that didn't exist, and by her husband. Her husband, the doctor. Husband. It was a new word, a beautiful word, and he'd actually done it. Without a dime to his name, her husband had worked his way through school and married her, just like he always said he would do. Since they were kids, he had always said he would marry her. At first it was a joke, and then it became more and more serious the older they got. And his older sister's husband, Dr. Stanley Love, had offered them a partnership opportunity in his practice in Walker, and it was an opportunity. She knew that, and she felt humbled by it and appreciative, but she wished that it was a little closer to her Idaho home. Oh, she missed her Idaho home. And she wished that someday they would be able to go back, even if not in Haley, just maybe somewhere in Idaho, somewhere close. It was in her prayers. Bob had been gone for those 3 hours. When she finally sat down to read the letter from her mother, she took up the brownish envelope upon which was scripted the ovular swirls of her mother's handwriting and withdrew the thin pages. My dearest Cynthia, we're so pleased to receive word from you and Bob. I just finished putting up choke cherries. There are so many jars that I'm going to send you some. I have no room for them in the cellar, at least not all of them. The ice cage is almost full as it is, which reminds me, Harry Purdom delivered ice today. He says to say hello to you and Bob. As we've said many times before, your father and I are very proud of you for everything, your music, your graduation from Westminster with such high marks. It's an achievement that will never be wasted. The experience gained and the discipline incurred in college from rising to meet such a challenge will prove invaluable, whatever your path in life may be. We're proud of Bob, too. If we didn't express it clearly, it was because things happened so fast. We had no time to prepare ourselves. My heavens, you could have given us some notice instead of practically eloping. I know we haven't always been supportive of you and Bob in days gone by, but we truly are pleased. I have to admit, in the beginning, I would have preferred you to choose someone like Tom Bailey if I'd have been given the choice. A mother wants the best for her daughter. You'll be the same when you have a daughter of your own. Dot smiled so hard she burst aloud in laughter. So that's why Tom Bailey was so persistent. Mother put him up to it. Tom would be waiting for her after church service on Sundays, and at the end of every Wednesday night choir practice, standing at the bottom of the steps by his expensive team and fancy buggy, a Whitechapel no less, rimmed yellow wheels spinning in elegance, hoping to be able to persuade her to let him drive her home. What girl wouldn't be proud? She always declined, sometimes forcefully, because she wanted to walk home with Bob, her childhood pal. One day, Bob had had enough. She came walking out of the church with Della Delano, dressed in sunset pink, pink hat, white ribbons, pink skirt, long sleeve, white blouse, and found 2 suitors with carriages waiting. Tom, with his Whitechapel, and Bob standing on the other side of the street beside a 4-passenger Surrey that he'd rented for an entire week's wages. The Surrey was a beauty. It put the Whitechapel to shame. Deep blue body, scrolled cream moldings, powder blue dusters and seat panels, fringe-topped canopy. Bob was like a king on a throne driving that thing, driving his lady home in that Surrey, in his dirty miner's clothes and hobnailed boots. On the way, they stopped and bought rhubarb and flowers from Vegetable Charlie, plodding along as he always did, carrying his rich-smelling fruits and vegetables in 2 deep baskets hung on poles across his aging shoulders, ever flashing his infectious Chinese grin and barking his sales pitch. You want lettucey? Radishy? You want a bean? You want a pea? Belly good. Belly, belly good. I suppose it was because I didn't really know Bob or his family that well. Heavens, here was a young man, penniless, who worked the many more in the summertime, and with all those rough and tumble miners, then he'd be off on that sheep train, working his way back east so he could go to college. I suppose we all thought that if he had any sense of responsibility, he'd be out there on that farm, helping his father make ends meet, like his older brothers. She finished the letter. Then Dot picked up pen and paper and began a response. My dearest mother, always so good to hear from you. I'm on pins and needles right now. It's all I can do to sit while Bob had his first patients moments ago, a little colored girl that came knocking at the door looking for Stanley. Stanley, bless his heart, for giving us the opportunity to go into business with him, fixed up the attic above his office as an apartment for us. He wasn't in, so Bob took the call himself. Dot didn't notice the door open as she was writing. She didn't notice her husband standing there until she looked up from her letter. He was soaked in blood, staring at her, his eyes begging for help. As God was her witness, she would never forget the look he bore that day. The breath rushed from her chest. I couldn't save him, is what he said when one voice finally allowed him. I lost them both. I just couldn't save him. When he'd arrived, the woman had been unconscious and hemorrhaging. There was no pulse. The labor had stopped. He had to pull the child so hard to get it out, he thought he was going to dismember it. But it didn't matter. The baby was gone, too. It was a boy. It would have been their only son. This was his first case, his first 2 patients. Inexperienced though he was, he knew exactly what was happening because of his flawless knowledge of anatomy. He knew that the placenta had pulled away from the uterus and that the bleeding had to be stopped. He knew exactly what was going on. He knew they had to get the baby out fast because oxygen was no longer being channeled to the child. The child was suffocating, trapped within the membranes of an airtight bag for 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes. The little one was warm when Bob pulled him free and seemed so close to life. The struggles of those last moments were frozen on Bob's face, and his fists were also the struggles were frozen on the child's face too. His tiny fists were tightly clenched, tiny fists no bigger than Bob's thumbnail. Bob tried to resuscitate the mother, to force air into her lungs, using arm lifts, chest pressure, all the textbook methods, but there was no response. Then he went for the child. When he had pulled him free, it was like popping a cork from a bottle. Blood had gushed from the vaginal opening, much of it in huge clots. The life-giving substance that should have been running through the mother's veins and arteries had instead been backing up uselessly inside the uterus. For the mother, there was no chance. At least the child still had blood in its body. Bob had to somehow induce respiration, get the diaphragm to work. He applied the prochonic method, the most commonly used, suspending the newborn upside down by the ankles and squeezing the chest while resting the head on the flat of a table. Nothing. The baby's fingernails and lips were black. He tried again and again. Still nothing. Thoughts were racing through his mind in fragments of seconds. All he could think of was to suck the mucus out with his own mouth, carefully, so as not to damage the fragile lungs. Still, there was no breath in the child's body. Perhaps if he blew his own air into the baby's body, used his own air to fill its lungs and stimulate the diaphragm, perhaps then he would be able to find his miracle. But mouth-to-mouth insufflation had yet to be recognized by the medical world. Bob held the baby's tongue with his fingers to keep it from sliding down its throat. He felt the rise and fall of its chest with each breath. He even thought for a moment there might have been a response, a loosening of the facial muscles. It was not to be. A human life without the oxygen for that length of time is not a life, no matter the effort. Now he sat with his wife, despondent over the loss. All Dot could think of was to say, "He's with our Lord now." Dr. Love explained later, "It's the luck of the draw. You had a bad draw, that's all. These situations happen, 1 in 100, I've heard it said. It was just your luck that it happened on your first time. Mostly in confinement cases, all you do is stand there and let it fall into your hands. Those people should have summoned help long before they did. It's their fault. They tried," spewed Bob, his anchor directed not at his brother-in-law, but at the people who slammed the doors to the little girl's pleas. "Even then it may not have turned out indifferently," said Dr. Love. "Even then we may not have been able to do anything. That type of condition is usually always fatal, regardless of birth precautions, regardless of whether or not a physician is in attendance. The best of physicians lose mother and child when that happens." Some days later, Bob sat alone in the darkened kitchen long after midnight. Dot, walking in, she woke up to find his side of the bed empty. She got up and came to him. He spoke to her from across the room. "I struggled through high school, getting up at 5 for chores, working the fields past sundown, studying until the moon itself is tired so I can go to college. Then, when I get to college, I work the mine so I can pay my way. I work the sheep trains for passage, all so I can be a doctor, so I can help people and live a good life." He was in his night clothes, arms folded, his chair back tipped against the table. Looking out at the open window, the curtains were lifting themselves inward from the chill of the night breeze. I was thinking about my days at American. Moonlight was shadowing his face in lustrous shades of gray compassion. American Medical College is one of the finest schools in the field of medicine. I never thought I had a chance even of getting in, let alone graduating, but I did, and somehow I figured out how to pay for it, and somehow or another I got that diploma. He waved in the direction where his graduating class photo was hanging framed and encased in glass out in the living room, which was really the far corner of the kitchen, living room and kitchen being all one room. I was counting the days, the months, the years. I knew that if I could just put on that cap and gown and cross that stage and shake that man's hand, the struggle would be over. He thought of those days now in fondness. The most difficult of times now seemed pleasant in comparison. The lack of sleep, the below-zero temperatures that rolled right through the paper-thin walls of his dormitory, the terror of exam time, the hellish anatomy exam in particular. A walk in the park compared to this. It caused his mouth to curve into a smile, the memory of that exam, of how, until a certain day, a certain point in the middle of a cold February night, he had been convinced he would fail. The complex names for bones and body parts had been jumbles in his brain, their impossible definitions floating loose, unassociated. The study of medicine as it passed into the 20th century was difficult at best. A student could depend on only one thing, that most of what was learned today would be disproven tomorrow. Textbooks were practically useless. Medical science was emerging from the shadows of quackery and magic overnight. Ironically, the facts coming forth seemed in themselves mythical. Mechanisms within the body that clone themselves against invading microforces, the intentional infections of microbes for the purpose of healing, the almost daily uncovering of newer and different strains of microbes. The discoveries and the theories were overwhelming and were stacking themselves one on top of another. X-rays, aspirin, the blood groups, chromosomes, messages of heredity, yellow fever, amino acids, and on and on. 24 hours a day was not enough. The young surgeon-to-be had somehow had to pack all that information into his brain, and then discard it, and pack in new information. Failure, as close as it was so unthinkable, so terrifying, that his mind dared not entertain it, not so much as a fleeting ghost. He remembered a playful kind of day when the sun was shining off the afternoon snow and sparkles, a day whose beauty only served to deepen the helplessness he felt. He was struggling to memorize anatomy, jumbles, unconnected jumbles, definitions, names, all jumbles. The glowing filament of an incandescent lamp revealed the complex diagrams and wordage of Henry Gray's 1858 text entitled Anatomy, Descriptive and Surgical. Later editions would simply be called Gray's Anatomy. Next to it, shaded in shadows, was a worn leather-bound version of Michnikov's Immunity and Infectious Diseases. Beside them both was an uncapped dark green fountain pen and furrows of papers upon which had been written notes from his classes and labs, where he'd scribbled out each one of those long Latin names after viewing and touching the actual body part, thanks to a cadaver named Uncle Josh. The names blurred before his eyes. He decided to take them just one at a time, just one name at a time. He decided to forget about the time squeeze, the fact that there were only 10 days to exam time. That way, he'd at least have one body part that he would know. Maybe by exam time, he'd know a dozen, maybe 100. However many, at least he would know them flawlessly, however many. He might fail the exam, but at least he would know those specific body parts as well as the good Lord who made them. He could see Glenn Smith, his roommate, from out the window, having fun in the snow with Oliver Mitchell and the boys, throwing snowballs, laughing, tipping their hats to the ladies. No exams for them. They were on different schedules and had already completed theirs. Watching his friends made his emptiness grow, a fathomless thing that was beyond loneliness, and his fear of the future deepened. The snow was white and smooth, another 4 or 5 feet, and Missouri might have been Idaho, except in Idaho the snow was dry and there were mountains. He especially loved the mountains in Idaho, right before the cresting of the sun, when the jagged tips of the Pioneer and White Cloud Range turned themselves into a kind of a lavender glow. It seemed like he'd never see home again, or if he did, it wouldn't be with Dot by his side. Would she wait for him? Some days he thought she would. She had decided more accurately, that they should wait another year before getting married so proper preparations could be made. Dot was the practical one. But she was having doubts. Was she? Or maybe not. But demons flooded his mind. Exhausted, his mind fell into sleep, an unwelcome savior, and his head flopped back against the wall. His thick black hair was flyaway and loose, having just been raked by frustrated fingers. Clutched in his hand, even in sleep, were the pages of a letter he'd penned. It somehow seemed just as important as the exam. St. Louis, February 7th, 1906. My own darling. I expected a letter from you yesterday, but as it didn't show, I just knew I would get one today. But Nixie, not for Bob. I don't know whether you are entitled to a letter tonight or not, after treating me in such a way. What do you think about that? Smith says his girl loves him more than mine does me, and the main point of the argument is the letter question. He gets 3 letters per week, rain or shine, and he knows exactly what mail they will be on. He certainly has me bested in that regard, but I tell him I have him skinned in every other way. You certainly would have a good laugh if you could hear us discuss our future plans, etc. And again, you might hear some things that wouldn't make you smile so much. Ha ha. I suppose girls get into some pretty interesting conversations at times, as well as the boys, don't they? Dearest, I wish I could be with you this eve. I am sure we would have an interesting talk, but what good would those wishings do? As you say, fly away vain thoughts. I am almost the busiest fellow in St. Louis, I have to tell you. I do believe. The profs are sure working us pretty hard. They thought they were not giving us enough to do by keeping us in school all day, so they added a night lesson 3 times per week to the schedule, and one of those is in chemistry. So you see where I stand. I have to arise at the early hour of 5 o'clock in the morning and go out to one of those packing houses after some beef eyes to be used for anatomical purposes. We're going to have an exam on the eye next Friday. I will be awfully glad when it is over, for it is one of the hardest branches in our curriculum. I know all this shop talk will be interesting to you. And then there's a blank because we couldn't read his writing, so we just left it blank. This is from an actual letter, by the way. The weather here has been awfully cold for the past few days. Our stove seems to have gone on strike, and we're almost froze out. The mercury is down to 0, and we feel that dreadfully here, for it's so penetrating. I am shivering right now like an Arkansas squirrel that has the ague. I suppose you and Della and your escorts go skating occasionally. Skating is fine on the different park lakes throughout the city here, but somehow or other, I have lost all desire for such sport. Presume it's because I am getting old. Darling, I am lonesome tonight. What can you do for me? If I could just have one of those sweet kisses, I am sure it would act like a panacea. I don't see how I am going to stay away from you all next summer. It almost makes me sick to think of it, darling. I love you more than my own life, and before I can be really happy, I must have you with me. I must close by giving you an imaginary good night hug and a kiss, and with hope that I'll get a letter tomorrow. Truly yours, Bob. When he wrote this, like I say, it was an actual letter, and when he wrote this, I wonder what he would think if he knew hundreds of thousands of people would be reading it in a book. Almost makes me feel guilty, like I should have asked him, but then that's pretty hard to do. A startling rush of cold jerked him awake. There was laughter and the clamoring of feet as Smith and the boys entered the room. He took a moment to breathe, like people do when they forget where they are, then walked over and put a piece of wood into the stove's crackling red belly, and closed it up quickly to keep from getting his fingers singed. The tiny stove, its pipe crooking upward into an iron-plated patch in the ceiling, was glowing around its bulging edges, but didn't seem to be doing much to stop old Jack Frost from creeping through the wall and back of him. It had been invading his sleep, chilling through into his dreams of Dot, of course. The boys stayed for a time, rescuing Bob from his fears, talked some, studied, then left, and Smith went to bed, and the demons came back. The sun had gone down, leaving now the moon to shine off the snow and shame him for his ineptness. He put in another piece of wood. And somehow, beyond that, in the middle of the night, by the light of that single incandescent lamp and the escaping glow from the stove fire, something very strange happened, something incredible. It all fell into place, all of it, everything. Not 100 names, but 1,000. More than he'd ever need for the exam. It must have all been there in his head, all that information, all those names. What must have been needed was a trigger, a catalyst to bring it all together, the step-by-step approach, one name at a time, something for his mind to wrap itself around. It was as though his mind had been instantly organized, with each name and definition categorized and cross-referenced. That burst of knowledge, like enlightenment itself, so enlivened Bob, so rushed through his veins and arteries, that to sleep was impossible, to sit was impossible. His mind was repeating names and definitions, reading them off inside his head like a sergeant at roll call. He was afraid to stop or even slow down. He was afraid if he did, he might forget it all. He threw on his wrap, coat, gloves, scarf, hat, muffs, and went for a stroll, speaking the names as he walked, reciting their definitions. Lateral, these are Latin names, and I'm not going to be able to do it, so I'm doing my best, okay? Lateral palpebral raphe, eyelid ligament attached to the zygomatic bone, much weaker than the medial palpebral, eyelid reference once again. Can be arteries or ligaments, 2 of them, encircling the eyelid, posterior peroneal septa, separates the lateral compartment of the leg. Hundreds and hundreds more. The air was clear and cold and the moon high, and its light streamed over the purity of the night like something sent by God to say congratulations. And as he walked, he realized his perception of reality had changed. The emptiness had been filled, the loneliness transformed, and his vision of the future no longer held fear. Dot was no longer seeming distant. The design of his future was now ordained. In a few short months, he'd have the letters MD after his name. He'd be in partnership with his sister's husband, a doctor in a small town in western Missouri between Springfield and Kansas City. There was, however, one slight problem. That part of his life that wasn't carved in chronological certainty, his Idaho darling. She was less than excited about living in Missouri. They hadn't even settled on a date for the wedding. These things can't be rushed into, she kept saying. They needed the summer, she kept telling him, so he could get settled into his practice, and then they could start planning things. But in the meantime, Tom Bailey and his Whitechapel would have more opportunity to court her. He walked some, up Euclid, down Forest Park, down Market Street, and then rode a ways in a taxi. The fare was free because he once tended to the lame leg of one of the driver's horses. He walked some more and stopped when he came to a postal station. Lights were burning in the back. Men in aprons and caps were stamping and sorting letters. He sauntered in as if he owned the place and gave them his letter. It was so important that it shouldn't be delayed for so much as a single day. He watched as it was stamped, St. Louis, Missouri, February 8th, 12:30 a.m., 1906, and thrown into a heavy bag and tossed into one of the waiting wagons for the trip to the train station and the journey westward. Then he walked down past the Rosebud, where even the police were afraid to go, where music rolled out like billows from a furnace, where raucous shouts and laughter came roaring into the night. The struggle was finally over. And he did indeed get the girl, the one in Idaho. They were married in Bellevue less than 6 months later. On June 30th, their foolish plans to spend another year apart vanquished, blown into oblivion by his brilliant threat to marry the non-existent girl in St. Louis. How ironic, he said, coming back to the brutality of the present, darkened kitchen. I now have everything. Everything I dreamed of. But it appears the struggle is just beginning. I have you. And I'm a doctor, all right, but my first two patients are dead, and I'm poverty-stricken. The new doctor has rent to pay, food to buy, a business partnership to buy into, and no patients except the two that died. 35 men and 3 women graduated with me that day. They're all doctors, too, and I'll wager that their patients are still among the living. He collected his thoughts with a deep breath and then held it and blew it out. Dot, dear, I've made a decision, a very difficult decision. Remember that land my father said he would give us? We could irrigate it from a portion of his Wood River divergence. He'd set us up with some cattle. I knew he would. He'd start us off with some seed. We wouldn't have to start paying him back until we... Quit medicine? Screeched Dot. She stormed over and stood squarely in front of him so that he could see the fire in her eyes. I've been farming my whole life, he said, longer than I've been studying medicine. Farming is something I understand. Dot stomped her foot so hard the pots hanging on the wall rattled. One fell to the floor. I will not let you do such a thing. I absolutely will not. You are a doctor. You are a smart man and a caring man, and you are a doctor. I will starve and live in poverty before I will let you defeat yourself. He grumbled out something unintelligible and looked away from his powerful wife, out the window at the moon. Several times he moved his mouth like he was going to speak. Finally he said, No bullfrogs. Dot slapped her hips and shook her head. Laughter spilled out from her mouth. What in heaven's name are you talking about? I hear crickets, he said, but no bullfrogs. I never noticed that before. There mustn't be any bullfrogs in Missouri. She smiled with forceful affection and kissed him, snaring his head between her 2 hands. What am I ever going to do with you? You want to hear a funny story? Bob said, I was walking across the street the other day with my bag and my new Prince Albert suit, and this old man asked me for a nickel. I didn't want to tell him the truth, that I didn't have a nickel either, so I just said no. Bob was smiling now, a little bit, a barely noticeable twitch of an expression. When was the last time your doctor stopped you on the street and asked you for money to buy food? A cigar? Now that's a different thing. That's a different story altogether. I never have a problem getting a good cigar. People give them to me for no reason. Why? Because they think I do have money. He was still morose, but with a lighter touch to it. Yes, indeed. It is an odd world out there, my dear wife, for a doctor, a farmer, mind you, a farmer whose crops have been destroyed by a flood or a tornado, has an abundance of help. The church comes with baskets of food. But who would ever guess that the doctor is hungry? Dot moved through the moonlight to the icebox. It so happens that the church did provide, she said. Bob pierced her with an angry look. She soothed him with her eyes. Relax, I said not a word about our money woes. It's Hazel Burnett's preparation from the buffet last night. I tricked her into giving me a good 2 days' worth. Bob's frown of disapproval left as she laid 2 big platters out onto the table. I told her that I simply had to have the recipe because for this food, my husband would die. Without this food, your husband may die, he said. Each time I opened my mouth to rave about how good it was and how much you'd like it, she gave me another scoopful. Finally, I had to quit talking because I couldn't carry anymore. Every sound, every sight was making Bob feel better. The whispering of Dot's bare feet across the floor, the rustle of her long nightgown, her nighttime hair, long down to the middle of her back, brushed to a golden strawberry sheen, the thick clunk of the icebox handle, the clink and rattle of dishes and silver. The food, cold though it was, threw its flavor into the air with such an essence that he could taste it before it touched his mouth. That simple meal in the moonlight of chicken, crusty bread slices, and rice was one of the finest of his life. Dot was right. Things did get better as the days passed into weeks. Business began to come, but the guilt remained. 13 months later, in the mountains of south-central Idaho, he'd get a chance at vindication when next would come a call from a mother in crisis during labor. To answer it would mean traveling avalanche-torn canyons by dog team in whiteout conditions at midnight. An absolute suicide mission. Okay, that's the end of chapter 4, but I've got notes at the end that I want to read rather than wait till the end, because then you would know what it was about. So I should have read the notes from chapter 1 through, we'll do that later. Let me read chapter 4. Fragile lungs, that part. Dr. Douglas Bissell, M.D., contribution of the nature, cause, and treatment of suspended animation in newborn. American Medical College was located at 407 South Jefferson Street in St. Louis. It was founded in 1873, though it doesn't exist anymore. The Rosebud, that's the interesting thing. When he mentions that he passed by the Rosebud. That's page 35. My grandfather never talked much about his days at American. Most of what I learned I discovered from his letters. I do remember, though, about him making references to the Rosebud, with a glimmer of humor in that hidden smile he'd sometimes get. At the time, I thought the look was there because he was talking about some fancy restaurant. He knew how boring I thought fancy restaurants were. He used to tease me about it, about how someday I'd change my mind when I wanted to take a girl to one. Now I know why that smile was there. The Rosebud, is because of my research, the Rosebud was a sporting house, a house of prostitution, and a well-known one at that. The Rosebud in St. Louis at 2222 Market Street was renowned and stands as a historical landmark even to this day. It's owned by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources and is rented out for parties and various gatherings. It's within walking distance of the original 1902 site of American Medical College and is recognized by historians as the spot where ragtime began its worldwide explosion. Any student at American would have known by its reputation what it was. It was billed as the headquarters for colored professionals in sports, located in the heart of Chestnut Valley, an early 20th century red light district. The Rosebud consisted of 2 bar rooms, a large room for gambling, and a hotel upstairs where the rooms were rented by the hour. It was a sprawling establishment, complex, taking up to close to an entire city block. The Rosebud closed in 1906, probably shortly after the young Dr. Robert Henry Wright took that walk and right before his graduation.